History as It Happens, November 22nd, 2024. Reconsidering Reagan.
Do not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology.
Investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry.
What has Ronald Reagan ever done for the state of California in his entire life, other than make a motion picture, Bedtime for Bonzo? Bonzo!
Professor Boyd, Bonzo, that wasn't a nice thing to do.
Ronald Wilson Reagan, age 64, former sports commentator, former film star, and former governor of California, makes his long-awaited
running because I have grown increasingly concerned about the course of events in the United States and in the world.
Although there's a Republican in the White House, this is a season of discontent for many members of the grand old party. Many of its conservatives regard President Ford as far too liberal.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Ronald Reagan as the next president of the United States.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Who was Ronald Reagan, a New Deal liberal who became a conservative lion? He started as a radio sportscaster in Iowa, then it was on to Hollywood, and then to television, politics, all the way to the White House, where he left his mark as one of the most consequential presidents in U.S. history. And he's left historians the task of separating legend from reality. The age of Reagan is over. His legacy endures. That's next with Max Boot as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
One of the most impressive presidential victories in American history. President Reagan and George Bush won 59% of the vote.
We did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
Tear down this wall.
He really gave America its mojo back after the 1970s. He guided America out of a very deep recession in the early 80s and really restored America's confidence in itself.
Dovii no provii. Trust but verify.
Ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Kipper.
On January 11, 1989, President Reagan addressed Americans from the Oval Office for the 34th and final time. In his farewell address, he reflected on what he viewed as his accomplishments over 8 long years, restoring the American economy, U.S. power and prestige, and the people's pride in their country. Things had come a long way since the dollar of the 1970s.
The way I see it, there were 2 great triumphs, 2 things that I'm proudest of. One is the economic recovery, in which the people of America created and filled 19 million new jobs. The other is the recovery of our morale. America is respected again in the world and looked to for leadership.
In the conclusion of his incisively written cradle-to-grave biography of the 40th president, historian Max Boot writes, these were indeed major achievements, even if the president deserved more credit for the recovery of American self-confidence than for the economic recovery. His role in raising military morale was particularly important. Reagan's unrelenting optimism and growing list of accomplishments had helped the nation to move beyond Watergate, the Vietnam War, gasoline lines, double-digit inflation, the Iran hostage crisis, and all the other traumas of the 1970s. It was, in many ways, his most significant legacy. But Boot goes on to say, like other presidents, Reagan exaggerated the amount of credit he deserved for an economic expansion while ducking blame for a recession. Average economic growth under Reagan was similar to other post-war presidencies and actually lower than under Bill Clinton, who raised taxes. Reagan's tax cuts, writes Boot, undoubtedly contributed to the expansion, as did all of his defense spending, but they did not cause it. If any individual deserved credit, it was Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. Page 714 and 715 of Max Boot's Reagan, His Life and Legend. These were not the only exaggerations in Reagan's farewell address or long career in public life. Of the many things I learned from reading this book, what stands out is the disconnect between reality and fantasy in Reagan's thinking, his worldview, and in the way he is remembered. Here's one example. When he left office, federal deficits had exploded in large part because of his tax cuts, combined with increased defense spending. Yet, as Boot writes on page 383, Reagan would claim that history shows that government would increase its revenues, thus reducing the deficit by cutting taxes. In 1980, he said that every time personal tax rates were cut, there was such an increase in prosperity that the government, even in the first year, got increased revenues, not less. Boot writes he would keep repeating this false claim for his whole presidency. In 1985, for example, he told incredulous members of Congress during a White House meeting, "You cannot show me a single time in history when a major tax cut did not result in greater revenues." In mid-1981, Reagan was trying to sell his economic program, so he did an Oval Office address. He said it would balance the federal budget in a few years.
For 19 out of the last 20 years, the federal government has spent more than it took in. There will be another large deficit in this present year, which ends September 30th. But with our program in place, it won't be quite as big as it might have been. And starting next year, the deficits will get smaller until in just a few years, the budget can be balanced.
The reality was quite different.
Any way you slice it, the Reagan deficit is huge, now officially larger than the deficits of all other American presidents combined. Someone calculated that the '83 deficit alone breaks down to $836 for every man, woman, and child in the country.
The deficit problem is very serious.
Reagan also subscribed to fantasies about the Soviet Union. Again, Max Boot, page 495. Contrary to Reagan's beliefs, the Soviet military buildup was not the result of any fantastical Soviet plan to destroy the United States or turn it into a Soviet satellite state. It was driven by the internal imperatives of the Soviet military-industrial complex and by the paranoia of Soviet leaders who feared their country would be attacked again, as it had been in the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, and World War II. Yet Reagan was firmly convinced, says Boot, that the Kremlin was carrying out a plot to take over the world, and doing so with increasing success because of supposed American weakness under his old adversaries Gerry Ford and Jimmy Carter. Now, Reagan did exhibit moral clarity about the Soviet Union, but his tough talk could be counterproductive. March 8, 1983.
I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Yet even in the so-called evil empire speech, Reagan said this.
This doesn't mean we should isolate ourselves and refuse to seek an understanding with them. I intend to do everything I can to persuade them of our peaceful intent, to remind them that it was the West that refused to use its nuclear monopoly in the 40s and 50s for territorial gain, and which now proposes 50% cut in strategic ballistic missiles and the elimination of an entire class of land-based intermediate-range nuclear missiles.
The Ronald Wilson Reagan that appears in Max Boot's biography is a conservative ideologue and a pragmatist. Reagan, despite what his liberal critics said, was no warmonger vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. He hated nuclear weapons, which explains why he got behind SDI, derisively called Star Wars.
It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
And Reagan wanted to de-escalate the Cold War, which he did with Mikhail Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev, mir na nas смотрит. The world is watching, and we've got something to show them.
You know, something else I learned here, Ronald Reagan was a terrible manager. He often did not know what his top people were doing, which, to cite one example, explains why he had no idea that Ollie North was running a CIA inside the CIA in the Iran-Contra scandal.
But let me put this in capital letters. I did not know about the diversion of funds. Indeed, I didn't know there were excess funds.
And the former Hollywood actor, while politically savvy, held such a flimsy grasp of policy that his own advisors and even world leaders who were aligned with him, like Margaret Thatcher, were baffled by his inattention to detail. Again, opening Max Boot's book to page 498, sitting at one of the National Security Council meetings where the discussion focused on how to respond to martial law in Poland, Richard Pipes noticed that the president rarely spoke and seldom listened attentively. Ronald Reagan, totally lost, out of his depth, uncomfortable, Pipes wrote in his diary. All this, both the substance and human conflict, is above and beyond him. He has not enough of either knowledge or decisiveness to cut through the contradictory advice that is being offered to him. Yet Pipes concluded Reagan understood remarkably well, intuitively rather than intellectually, the big issues. So there you have it. Despite all his shortcomings, Ronald Reagan was a leader. he connected with the American people. And by the time he departed Washington, the world and history seemed to be going his way. He is remembered as a successful president. The scandals did not stick. Also largely forgotten is Reagan's role as an FBI informant, reporting on communist activities in Hollywood. As Boot writes on page 167, by the end of the 1940s, Reagan came to share the paranoia of reactionaries about communist infiltration of American society, but as with his later role in the 1960s white backlash against civil rights, he would act his part more subtly and less provocatively than the most perfervid partisans of the far right. Indeed, his 1947 testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee was acclaimed as a model of middle-of-the-road good sense.
Not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology, because we've spent 170 years in this country on the basis that democracy is strong enough to stand up and fight for itself against the inroads of any ideology, no matter how much we may disagree with it. But at the same time, I never, as a citizen, want to see our country become so, or become urged by either fear or resentment of this group that we ever compromise with any of our democratic principles through that fear or resentment.
We agree with that,
I still think that democracy can do it.
Boot goes on to say, from 1945 to 1950, Reagan established himself as an anti-communist labor leader with a national profile, laying the groundwork for his future political career without necessarily being conscious that he was doing so. So I hope you take the time to read Max Boot's Reagan, His Life and Legend, because in a relatively short podcast, we cannot cover every chapter of Ronald Reagan's life and times, from his first job as a radio broadcaster to his Hollywood acting career, which included 1951's Bedtime for Bonzo. Reagan plays a psychology professor trying to teach a baby chimp to act like a human.
Eat your pablum like a good boy, and pretty soon you'll grow up to be a big, strong, handsome man just like your daddy. Then you'll have Swedish pancake, too.
That's outright bribery.
Bonzo!
Professor Boyd, Bonzo, that wasn't a nice thing to do.
Bonzo!
Don't scold him, he didn't mean it.
Well, that's beside the point. Aggressiveness like that could become an aberration.
To his entry into electoral politics in the 1960s.
You've heard a great deal about my lack of experience. That's true. Lack of experience actually in holding public office. But I know that there comes some times when if you want a job done, maybe you get somebody in who hasn't found out all the things you can't do.
There's something else to think about here. Continuities between Reaganism and Trumpism, and departures. Today's GOP is dramatically different than the party of Reagan. The world is dramatically different today. There is no Soviet Union. But do you know who was the last president to sign an amnesty for illegal immigrants?
I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally.
Max Boot, it is an honor to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Why did you want to write a book about Ronald Reagan, a cradle-to-grave biography of Reagan, someone who's been written about quite a bit?
Well, it's true that there have been a lot of books about Reagan, but when I started this in 2013, there really was not a definitive biography that really provided an objective overview of his life and his career. And that's what I set out to do, to write something that was neither a hagiography nor a hit job, but rather presented his successes as well as his failures, his strengths, as well as his weaknesses. And so I've been very gratified to see some of the reviews, for example, the New Yorker saying that Reagan, His Life and Legend, aspires to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. So that was kind of my mission accomplished moment there.
Well, something that is true in retrospect, and you do a great job bringing this out in your book, is that our memories of Reagan don't square with his actual record, especially on the right. He's lionized as a conservative hero, and to some degree he was.
That's true. He was, and he always had a great relationship with the Republican base because he spoke their language quite literally. And what he said, tugged at the heartstrings of Republicans over many decades. And yet, what I found is that there was quite a disconnect between Reagan, the campaigner, and Reagan in government, that he was actually much more pragmatic, much more moderate in government than he sounded on the campaign trail. And it was that pragmatism and moderation that I think accounted for a lot of his success, whether as governor of California or as president of the United States, because in both offices, he cut deals with Democrats. He was not an absolutist. He often said he would rather compromise and get 80% of what he wanted rather than go over the cliff with his flags flying, which is a term that he often used to describe kind of absolutist conservatives who demanded my way or the highway. That was certainly not Ronald Reagan's approach to governance. He was constantly compromising with Democrats in both Sacramento and Washington.
You know, he had luck on his side as well, which is an underappreciated aspect of success in politics and timing. But your treatment of him also brought out a darker edge about his thinking, some of his positions, maybe earlier in his political career rather than later, although his administration's record on civil rights wasn't great. We'll get into all of that. You're a conservative, correct me if I'm wrong, you're disaffected Republican because of what's happened to the party in the age of Trump. As you wrote this book, did our current dilemma influence your interpretation of Reagan's Republican Party?
Maybe to a certain extent. I mean, I'm somebody who used to be a Republican, and after 2016, I became an independent. And I think being an independent has actually allowed me to view Ronald Reagan's life and career with greater objectivity and distance than would have been possible before. So I think I'm much more aware of his foibles and failures and shortcomings than I would have been, or I certainly was, growing up in the 1980s as a young conservative who was a huge fan of Ronald Reagan. Now I think I have a more objective and mature perspective on him. And certainly I think any historian writing in whatever period, there's this underlying question of like, how did we get here? How do we, using history, explain the current day? And obviously you can get carried away with that and take it too far because you have to be very alive to the differences between the past and the present. And there are huge differences between, for example, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. But nevertheless, one of the questions that certainly interested me as I was doing this was, how did we get from Reagan to Trump and what led the Republican Party to where it is today? And this book was not motivated by Donald Trump. I began it, in 2013 when nobody could have imagined that this real estate developer could possibly be president of the United States. There are almost no mentions of Trump in the book. It's really trying to tell the Reagan story, but there's no question that with any historian, your knowledge of the present informs your analysis and interpretation of the past.
There are always continuities. There are always departures. And I think some of this ugly right-wing populism permeating our politics today, it was there under Reagan. It was not his priority, but it was there. Pat Buchanan worked in his administration. And the world that Reagan and then George H.W. Bush believed they were bequeathing their successors dissolved or never really was realized. Some of that misplaced optimism of the early 1990s. But I guess my point is we can overdraw the continuities, right, between 1989 and 2016. And there's a lot of time there that passed between Reagan and Trump's rise. So,
yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think the differences between Reagan and Trump are greater than their similarities. But, there are still some continuities. I mean, you can see by the fact that, Reagan had a passion for cutting taxes and appointing conservative judges. And those are passions that have continued in the current Republican Party. And, Reagan was certainly could be insensitive to racial issues. That's certainly true of the Republican Party today. But there are also huge dissimilarities, including the fact that Reagan was pro-immigration. He legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. Reagan was pro-free trade. He was pro-alliances. He was pro-NATO. He was pro-standing up to Russian aggression. And fundamentally, I think he was just a very different personality than Trump. And Reagan's personality kind of infused the entire Republican Party and made it very appealing to a lot of people in those days because Reagan was such a sunny, optimistic person and a consummate gentleman who never engaged in name calling and always had this very idealized vision of America as a shining city on a hill. And that was, I think, what inspired a lot of people and gave him a lot of cross-partisan appeal. I mean, remember, in 1980, he won 44 states. In 1984, he won 49 states. He was much more unifying than the leaders that we see today.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was about to bring up the shining city on a hill from his farewell address. Today, Donald Trump says the United States is a garbage can.
Right, and we're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world. That's what's happened. That's what's happened to. We're like a garbage can.
Past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man.
I think that sums it up. So about Reagan's personality, he was consistent from youth to old age. He had a certain way of looking at the world where he could ignore unpleasant realities. And, he's been described as an enigma. He was aloof, especially with his own family, which is surprising, maybe to people who aren't aware of the family dynamic. So I was grappling with this question all through your book. Maybe this guy's not as complicated as we've made it out to be. Maybe he was simply a person who did not have a very sophisticated way at looking at the world. And sometimes that worked out well for him, but when you get into complex situations, it doesn't work out very well.
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth to that. He was often criticized for having a somewhat simplistic worldview. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I would not say he was a simple person, because I think there were complexities and depths to him and contradictions. I mean, for example, the fact that as a politician, he could be very confrontational. He was the guy who fired the air traffic controllers when they went on strike. He was the guy who said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But in his private life, he was completely non-confrontational. He would never get into arguments or disputes with his kids or with his aides or just about anybody. He shied away from confrontation. Or, the fact that he, in his public life, played this very avuncular, friendly, outgoing person who was, seemingly everybody's neighbor next door. And yet in his real private life, he was actually very remote, aloof, somewhat introverted, didn't really have any close friends. So I think that there are, like with any character, there are complexities to Reagan's character. To a large extent, his character and upbringing that led him to often oversimplify issues and to put things into very stark terms that appeal to his desire to see the world as he wanted to be rather than it actually was.
He had a rough childhood, an alcoholic father who was not physically abusive, but could not keep a job. Family had to move around. They were very, very poor during the Great Depression, of course, who wasn't? Maybe he carried some of those traumas with him about not wanting to get into arguments and fights and confrontations with people.
Reagan's personality, all people really, Reagan's personality was forged by his childhood. In his case, yes, it was the family kept having to move from town to town because his alcoholic father, Jack, kept losing one job after another. And so he never got close to the other kids when he was young. And so he wanted to keep other kids at a remove because he didn't want them to know about the family secret, his father's alcoholism. And so he kind of created this mental barrier around himself that would be there for the rest of his life. And I think it was also his horror of personal confrontation can be traced back to the arguments that his father, Jack, and mother, Nellie, had when Jack would go off on, a multi-day bender and spend the family rent money on alcohol and come back home. And obviously, Nellie would not be too happy about that. And, little Dutch Reagan and his brother Moon could hear their parents arguing through the thin walls of their rented house. And so, that created this aversion to confrontation. And I think his mother was also a very important influence in his life because she was this very religious, almost saintly woman who was always taking care of prisoners and hospital patients and others, always taught her son Dutch to have this relentlessly upbeat outlook on the world, no matter how grim their personal circumstances. She taught him to always look on the bright side of life. And that's something he always did. And that kind of led to an almost Pollyannish worldview where he kind of ignored problems or serious issues, whether in his personal life or in America's life. But it was also inspirational and certainly worked for him from a political perspective because he was always relentlessly optimistic.
Maybe it's too much to say he was a fantasist, but he did embrace fantasies about his own life and also about the world, and he stuck to them. And you make the point that in those days, there were no fact checkers at newspapers, so they would just repeat what he said. For instance, he would repeat this story that when he was a radio announcer in the 1930s, he tried to help end racial segregation in baseball. He used this story as a defense when people accused him of being a racist or unaware of the plight of African Americans in American history. But there was no truth to this story, but he repeated it all the way, throughout his life. Yet, he was also an actor, not a very good one. So I said he may be a fantasist on one hand, but he didn't have a good range as an actor because of some empathy deficit, right? I guess this is not so much a question as a word salad, Max, but I'm just trying to get my mind wrapped around his personality. It is difficult to explain some of these things.
Yeah, no, I think everything you're saying is true. And he certainly, his superpower was to imagine the world as he wanted to be rather than as it was. And again, that was very inspirational when he was president in the early 1980s after a very grim decade of the 1970s, Watergate, inflation, Vietnam, Iran hostage crisis, gasoline lines. There were a lot of things going wrong. And yet he saw everything as upbeat. And he had this vision of morning again in America, as the slogan he ran on in 1984.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years.
But the flip side of that was, yes, he often indulged in fantasies about the world and about his own life. And you mentioned one of them, the fact that he pretended to have crusaded against segregation in baseball in the 1930s, which was simply untrue. There is zero evidence that he ever spoke up about it. In fact, he was, in later life, he was an opponent of civil rights legislation, opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, opposed the Voting Rights Act, opposed the lunch counter sit-ins of civil rights activists, opposed school busing, on and on and on. And so he kind of created this fantasy about how he was colorblind and had crusaded against segregation in baseball. And as I uncover in the book, it just wasn't so.
Oh, his embrace of Jesse Helms in 1975-76 when Reagan wanted to challenge Ford. That was shameful. If you take all of his positions and statements about civil rights without attaching the name Ronald Reagan to them, and you ask somebody, okay, look at all these positions and statements, would you call somebody who adheres to these views a racist? They might say yes. Yet that label has never really adhered to Reagan, maybe because in his personal interactions with black people, he wasn't a nasty person. Would you consider Reagan racist based on his views of civil rights?
I mean, I certainly think he had racist views, but I think that was true of pretty much all white people in those days, and arguably even in our day. I mean, and not just white people. I mean, racism is very pervasive throughout every culture in every country. And certainly Reagan was certainly not immune to it. I mean, he was somebody who was born in 1911. He was born in a very different America. Even his hometown of Dixon, Illinois, even though he never wanted to talk about this, even Dixon, Illinois had segregation where at the Lode movie theater, the African Americans had to sit separately from the whites. And it was a hotbed of KKK activity in the 1920s, as I discovered in the course of my book research. So, yes, no question he had racist attitudes. And he was even captured on a White House tape talking with Richard Nixon and using a racial epithet to refer to African diplomats at the UN. But
he called them monkeys, right?
Right.
Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television, as I did. Yeah. To see those monkeys from those African countries. Damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
And so no question he had these attitudes, but, I think it's also true that I talked to his kids and they told me that he always brought them up to oppose bigotry and prejudice. And I think that's true. And he did have this image in his own head of that his father, Jack, who is an Irish American Catholic, had been the victim of discrimination, that Jack had told him never to indulge in prejudice or bigotry. So he was not George Wallace, let's put it that way. I mean, there were certainly people in politics of his era who were much more openly bigoted. And I think Reagan's, the secret of his success was that he did not employ blatantly racist appeals in the way that George Wallace did. Reagan used dog whistles, and like in 1980, he spoke about states' rights, or earlier he spoke about welfare queens.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers,
to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
He spoke about law and order and not wanting our streets to become jungle paths after dark. And people, I think people got the message, but he delivered it in a ostensibly race-neutral manner. So he didn't turn off a lot of moderate white voters.
I guess it's disappointing that even in the 1960s, you refer to how racial views were commonplace from Reagan's generation, who was born in 1911. But in the 1960s, when the tide was turning, he still didn't come around. Although I believe when he was president, he did sign a reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So
he did. I mean, his administration, at any rate, tried to roll back a lot of civil rights laws, but he was largely unsuccessful because of bipartisan opposition. And so he had opposed the Voting Rights Act from the beginning, but wound up signing an authorization of it. And he was very skeptical, or really opposed to a Martin Luther King national holiday. But once he realized that it had overwhelming support in Congress, he signed the bill.
And again, it didn't seem to come from some personal animus on his part. He didn't really know a lot of African Americans when he was growing up. So he just seemed to be really unaware of what African Americans had been going through during the Jim Crow times. And he thought that the Civil Rights Act was unfair to white people. I don't want to talk about civil rights the entire time here, but just last.
No, I think that's right. I think one of his few black friends throughout his life was one of his teammates on the football team at Eureka College in the 1930s, later commented about how Reagan just seemed to be unaware of the extent of discrimination and racism in the Midwest, whereas, his black teammate was very aware of it because he realized he could walk into a hotel or restaurant and might not get served because of his race. But Reagan was kind of oblivious to that.
So whenever I pick up a big book like this, I always have a few items I hope I learn something about. And one of them was the origins of Reagan's conservatism, his conservative philosophy, if you will. Now, politicians are not always intellectuals or philosophers. Maybe Thomas Jefferson was, right? Woodrow Wilson was an intellectual. Reagan, the sources of his anti-government views, anti-communist attitudes, they're not very impressive. It seemed to be a mix of personal experiences. He blamed the failure of his acting career and, some labor strife in Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s on communism. So a mix of personal experiences and also right-wing tracts by the John Birch Society seemed to influence Reagan's turn from a New Deal liberal to this hard-right ideologue.
Well, this was one of the central mysteries that I wanted to uncover in this book. How did this one-time New Deal Democrat who voted for FDR 4 times and really worshipped FDR, how did he become such a hard-right, far-right conservative by the early 1960s? And what makes it hard to uncover is the way that Reagan described his transformation is completely inaccurate, because he often said, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to suggest that the Democrats had suddenly veered to the left in the 1950s, which just was not the case at all. I mean, in 1960, John F. Kennedy actually ran to Richard Nixon's right on defense policy and was firmly committed to combating communism. So this was not an accurate description of his own evolution. And so you have to really look at his life much more critically and independently. And I traced the evolution beginning in World War II, where as a highly paid actor, he was very unhappy about paying 90% rates of income taxation. And then after the war, as you alluded to, he blamed the federal government for breaking up the studio monopoly and basically hurting his own career. And then he got involved, as his movie career waned, he got involved in the hothouse politics of Hollywood during the McCarthy era, where he became convinced that he was combating a communist plot to take over Hollywood, which, as I argue in the book, was largely a figment of his own imagination, but it was something that this was a common trope at the time. And he was an FBI informant. The FBI told him this was the case. He was very credulous about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And so he became a very hard right anti-communist by the late 1940s. And then his transformation was really completed, as I argue, in the 1950s, when he went to work for General Electric as host of General Electric Theater and as a spokesman. And in those days, GE was a very right-wing company because they viewed spreading free market propaganda as being essentially an inoculation against union troubles. And so in those days, Reagan had a lot of time to read because he was afraid of flying. So he would take the train from LA to New York, and he would be reading these tracts that the GE executives would be pushing on their employees. And many of them were these very right-wing conspiratorial tracts. And Reagan really came to believe it. And then he would give speeches that espoused many of these viewpoints. And so that kind of completed his transformation, so that, by the early 1960s, this one-time New Deal Democrat was accusing Democrats of taking America forward under the banners of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, which was the kind of crazy talk you heard from the John Birch Society, but that's what he was now, by this point, espousing.
You start chapter 18 with a quote from John F. Kennedy. They equate the Democratic Party with the welfare state with socialism, and socialism with communism. Reagan didn't really understand Marxism. You make this point in the book. Marx wanted revolution, whereas proposals like Medicare or Medicaid were designed to preserve the existing system. They weren't creeping socialism, but Reagan ran on these ideas. I mean, he railed against Medicaid or Medicare.
Yeah, he railed against both Medicaid and Medicare as socialized medicine and claimed that they would lead to the total loss of freedom in America. But yes, he was not exactly a student of Marxism. He really subscribed to these myths created by the John Birch Society. Along with these, he often repeated these phony quotations that the Birchers attributed to Lenin and Bukharin and various other communist leaders, explaining their dastardly plot to take over America by first, making America socialist and then communist, and claiming that, Medicare and Medicaid and other social welfare legislation was basically part of this plot to communize America, which, as you point out, was kind of the opposite of reality, because in classic Marxist theory, they did not want to improve the welfare of the proletariat in a capitalist society. They wanted to accentuate the contradictions of capitalist society, leading eventually to a violent revolution. So this had nothing to do with Marxism, but this was part of this very conspiratorial right-wing worldview that Reagan imbibed in the 60s.
One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine. It's very easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. Most people are a little reluctant to oppose anything that suggests medical care for people who possibly can't afford it. This was simply an excuse to bring about what they wanted all the time, socialized medicine.
He wrapped up this radio address by telling his listeners to call their congressman to oppose the bill.
If you don't, this program, I promise you, will pass just as surely as the sun will come up tomorrow. And behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country, until one day, as Norman Thomas said, we will awake to find that we have socialism. And if you don't do this, and if I don't do it, one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
His knowledge of foreign policy in these days was fairly limited. He saw communism as more of a domestic problem. Yet, as was the case in many aspects of his career in life, he never went too far where he would have been a full-on nutcase. So he never questioned Eisenhower's patriotism, even though he may have been unhappy with certain parts of Eisenhower's moderate republicanism, as were the people like William F. Buckley.
Yeah, no, I think he had a very good sense of how far he could go without coming across as a complete kook. And he never crossed that line. And the real kooks, like the John Birch Society, they claim that Eisenhower was a communist agent. Reagan, by contrast, actually admired Eisenhower. And so he certainly had tremendous political sense that kept him within the bounds of the acceptable, even though as a campaigner, he was certainly on the right-wing edge of American politics, but he didn't go over the edge, I guess you would have to say.
There certainly were intellectuals with some heft in the formation of the modern conservative movement in this country, but the historian Rick Perlstein has made a similar point. A lot of it was just thin gruel or stuff like the Birch Society. It wasn't always theorists and intellectuals.
Well, that's right. I think there was a tendency on my part when I was a young conservative to idolize, William F. Buckley and National Review, and to see them as very high-minded paragons of intellectual sophistication. But the reality is, like, if you actually look at what National Review was saying in the 50s and 60s, they were crudely defending segregation. They were defending apartheid in South Africa. They had some pretty extreme views, and that was at a time when Ronald Reagan was one of the charter subscribers of National Review, read it every week, became friends with Bill Buckley. And so, I think that their views moderated over the decades, but certainly in the 50s and 60s, in retrospect, they were very far to the right, and shockingly so, I think, from a modern sensibility.
Page 228 of your book, in a 1964 editorial, Buckley labeled the civil rights movement Black Madness. I mean, as the kids say these days, quotes like that don't age very well. What's really interesting, too, about Reagan's upbringing as a conservative, if you will, after being a New Dealer, is that he didn't want to become a politician. He wanted to be a successful actor. He wanted to be an A-lister. He broke through to the A-list for a short time. But when acting fell apart for him, he needed to find something else to do. And I don't want to say he just kind of fell into these positions, but he did become a national figure, even though he wasn't intending on a career in politics. How much of that was, well, he just needed to find something to do, and he didn't have any idea of what it would lead to?
I think all of that was true. I mean, I think he was always very interested in politics, whether it was a young New Dealer or as a right-winger later on. I mean, one of the funny things about Reagan is that in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, he often bored castmates in movies by talking about politics all the time. The irony is that when he was in Sacramento and Washington, he often bored people he was talking with there by talking about show business all the time. But these were kind of the twin poles of his life. And I'm sure he would have been very happy to stay in Hollywood if he had greater success there. His movie career became a dead end because of World War II, where he was gone from the screen for a few years. Even though he never left Hollywood, he was making training films for the Air Force. But then after the war, there was a new generation of stars like Gregory Peck and John Wayne, and whose stars were glowing much more brightly than Ronald Reagan's. And so he basically got involved in politics because he didn't have much else to do. There wasn't a huge demand for his services from the studios. And then, he went from being president of the Screen Actors Guild to this spokesman for GE, and eventually this kind of national conservative spokesman who in 1964 gave this very popular and powerful television appeal on behalf of Barry Goldwater. It became known as a time for choosing speech.
We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help, the reduction in the need for public housing? But the reverse is true. Each year the need grows greater, the program grows greater. We were told 4 years ago that 17 million people went to bed hungry each night. Well, that was probably true. They were all on a diet.
And at that point, he had been fired from General Electric Theater, which, he blamed on the Kennedy administration, kind of conspiratorial thinking on his part. But then he really had almost nothing to do. By that point, he had developed this national political profile. And so he saw an opening to challenge Pat Brown for governor of California. And then, to everybody's surprise, except maybe his own, he won by 1 million votes.
Not too many days ago, our country was on fire because an assassin's bullet took one man's life. Whatever you may think of Martin Luther King, whether you approved or disapproved, I think something of America was killed also. And I think the murder of that man and the death of America began with the first acceptance of compromise with the law, tolerance of those who would apply the law unequally because of race or religion, and acceptance of those who advocate breaking those laws with which they're in disagreement. And it includes those in government, unless and until they have the courage to say that the law will be enforced equally to all and at all times with no exceptions.
Yeah, that was another dark aspect of his thinking. We were talking about civil rights, the law and order stuff. Now, there were, of course, riots in urban areas in the United States in the 1960s, and the campuses were on fire. But his views there also do not reflect well on Reagan, the way he handled the riots, or the protests. The rioting or the violence was mostly on the part of the police that were sent in to deal with the kids who opposed the Vietnam War, etc. But you're right, he was always interested in politics, but as far as running for elected office, it seems he only made that transition in the 60s, maybe because of the Goldwater speech, and conservatives were looking for somebody who was persuasive and charismatic, unlike Goldwater, who was totally destroyed by LBJ in 1964, leading many commentators to say that there would never be a conservative president of the United States.
In your heart, you know he's right. Go, go, Goldwater! Let's go, Goldwater! Let's go, Goldwater all the way! Just raise them up to cast your votes for Mr. USA! Goldwater!
So we're talking about Reagan, the conservative, the conspiracy theorist. Then he's a liberal governor. His record in California, other than the law and order stuff, was pretty liberal. How do you explain that? Well, there were Democrats in both houses of the state legislature, so he had to. But still, he could have been a hardliner.
Yeah, no, this was his pragmatic streak. I think he surprised a lot of people. And there was a John Bircher in the state Senate who even claimed that Reagan was some kind of false flag operative, and he had been luring them in, and he was still a liberal Democrat all along, which he wasn't, but he was just somebody who believed in compromise. And I think he was open to argumentation. And so I think part of the disparity between Reagan on the campaign trail and Reagan in office was he kind of reacted to what people wanted to hear. And on the campaign trail, he was speaking exclusively to Republican right-wing audiences. So they wanted, conservative red meat type of things. Whereas in office, he was actually dealing with Democrats all the time. He had aides who were relatively apolitical, and his incentives there were not simply to grandstand. He actually wanted to get things done, and he knew to get things done, he would have to work with Democrats. And if his aides or Democrats or somebody else, if they presented a good argument to him, he was amenable to persuasion. I mean, I even uncovered in the minutes of his cabinet meetings in Sacramento, at one point, he actually told his cabinet, the politics of the thing doesn't count. We need to do what's right and avoid doing what's wrong. And this was not for public consumption. He was actually saying this to his cabinet. And so he took a lot of counterintuitive stances, including, signing a liberal abortion law, a tough gun control bill. He presided over prison reform. He raised spending. I mean, he railed against hippies and beatniks at the universities, and yet he still raised spending on higher education by 136% as governor of California. So he turned out to be much more moderate and centrist, such that I talked to Jerry Brown, who was the son of Pat Brown, the man that he beat, and Jerry Brown was Reagan's successor as governor. And I said to Jerry Brown, what did you think of Ronald Reagan as governor? And Jerry Brown's answer was, he was a pretty good governor, which is not what I think a lot of Reagan fans would expect to hear from a liberal Democrat like Jerry Brown.
Willie Brown praised him as well.
Absolutely, yes.
No, he seemed to be a successful governor of California, and that launched him onto a national political career. Would you say he was lucky not to win the 76 nomination?
Probably so, because that was not a Republican year. And if he had won the nomination, he might have lost to, Jimmy Carter, and that would have been the end of his political career. Instead, he very narrowly lost the Republican nomination to Gerald Ford, but it was such a near-run thing that after Ford's defeat, Reagan was left standing as kind of the heir apparent to the Republican Party.
But also because of everything that was about to happen. Jimmy Carter was not an effective executive, although his record is being rehabilitated, if you will, or being reassessed, I should say, by historians. Not as bad as it may appear at first glance. But Carter did not handle the crises well, and many of these crises would have happened under Reagan's watch. So that's what I meant by being lucky. I think anyone elected in 76 would have had a hard time being reelected in 1980.
I think that's right. And you saw, across the world, there was kind of a greater openness to conservative free market ideas. Margaret Thatcher wins in the UK, Reagan wins in the US. There was kind of a backlash against the post-war, New Deal type liberalism. And so his timing was kind of perfect in that he lost in 76, but won in 80 when the country was much more receptive to his message.
So let's jump now to his presidency. He wins in November 1980, delivers his inaugural address January 1981.
The economic ills we suffer have come upon us over several decades.
They will not go away in days, weeks, or months, but they will go away. They will go away because we, as Americans, have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Foreign policy wasn't a big part of that inaugural address, but in his first term, he takes a really hardline stance vis-a-vis relations with the Soviet Union. Reagan had once been a supporter of détente, then he turned against it. Was that first-term hardline stance counterproductive?
I believe it was. I mean, I think there's this mythology that's grown up because Reagan did take this hardline anti-Soviet stance in his first term. And of course, within a decade, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. And so a lot of Reagan admirers tend to draw a connection between, Reagan was the hardliner, and therefore Reagan brought down the Soviet Union. But in fact, I don't see much evidence for that having been the case. And all that Reagan raised defense spending, he called the Soviet Union the evil empire, all that kind of rhetoric and activity, including the SDI, the Star Wars Defense Initiative, all those things actually ratcheted up tensions and increased the risk of war. And in 1983, we had several near brushes, the worst that we had experienced since the Cuban Missile Crisis, when World War III could have easily broken out. And I think Reagan was kind of sobered by that experience and started to dial back his rhetoric and understood that, he needed to do more to avert nuclear Armageddon, which was a constant fear of his. And he wanted to meet with Soviet leaders, but as he kept saying, as he said, they kept dying on me. He didn't have somebody to meet with in his first term. And it was only when his policy towards the Soviet Union started to become successful in 1985, when Chernenko kicked the bucket and Mikhail Gorbachev became the new leader of the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev was a different kind of Soviet leader. He was somebody who had risen to the top of the system, but lost faith in it and wanted to reform it. And his reforms were really what set in motion the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that wasn't something that Reagan did. He didn't set that in motion. But I think to Reagan's credit, he understood that Gorbachev was somebody he could do business with, as Thatcher told him. And he basically broke with decades of his anti-communist ideology to establish this working relationship with the world's number one communist in order to end the Cold War and reduce the level of nuclear danger. And so I think that's the ultimate tribute to his pragmatism.
Yeah, the far right bashed him for talking to your enemy. But to me, that's his most important foreign policy legacy. Not to get into a big discussion about how the post-Cold War period has turned out, but he de-escalated the Cold War. You're right. He did not cause the Soviet Union to collapse. He finally had a partner, and talk about contingency in history, had all those dinosaurs in the Soviet gerontocracy not died. The Politburo would never have had an opportunity to appoint somebody like Gorbachev. And if the Politburo knew what Gorbachev, the path he would eventually pursue, they probably would not have chosen him. But this myth, you can't debunk it enough. It just sticks around that Reagan caused the Soviet Union to collapse. I know that you don't buy into it. You just explained why. But I don't think that myth is ever going to go away.
No, just because, if you just look at it very superficially as a matter of timing, you can see that the Soviet Union did collapse shortly after the Reagan presidency. So it's easy to give him credit, even though, I actually asked George Shultz, as Secretary of State, I said, Mr. Shultz, did you and the Reagan administration, did you have a plan to bring down the Soviet Union? And he laughed. He said, no, we didn't. I wish we had, but we didn't. We just had a general peace through strength attitude. So even George Shultz, who was the architect of Reagan's foreign policy, denies this myth, but it still won't go away.
Can you resolve the debate over who is more to blame for the failure of the Reykjavik summit in 1986? So Reagan and Gorbachev are meeting in Iceland. We're talking about SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. Apparently only two people in the world believe that there could be space lasers to knock out nuclear weapons, and that was Reagan and Gorbachev. And because of this impasse over SDI, an agreement that would have been historic to get rid of nuclear weapons could not be realized at that summit. Do they both share blame for that?
I mean, sure, they both share blame, but I would disagree with you a little bit, because I don't think Gorbachev believed that SDI was a practical proposal. His concern was not that Reagan was actually going to create the space shield that would render America invulnerable from nuclear attack, because Gorbachev's own scientific advisors were telling him that was a fantasy, as, by the way, were Reagan's scientific advisors. But Gorbachev's concern was that if America pursued this SDI program, the Soviet military-industrial complex would basically use that as an excuse to ramp up defense spending, whereas Gorbachev wanted to reduce defense spending and devote more money to social welfare programs. But at Reykjavik, the two men came tantalizingly close to an agreement to abolish nuclear weapons within 10 years. I'm not sure that was ever very realistic, but they were very close to that. But then the agreement fell apart because Reagan would not agree to confine SDI to the lab. He would not accept any restrictions on SDI, even though his own advisors were saying there's not going to be anything ready to test for a decade. But he was very devoted to SDI. And so that led to the end of the meeting. And both Gorbachev and Reagan walked away from Reykjavik angry and disappointed at the way the summit concluded. But in the long run, it didn't really matter that much, because the next year they got together in Washington and signed the INF Treaty abolishing intermediate-range nuclear weapons.
On the Soviet side, over 1,500 deployed warheads will be removed, and all ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, including the SS-20s, will be destroyed. On our side, our entire complement of Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles, with some 400 deployed warheads, will all be destroyed.
And yeah, that agreement, had it been made, I mean, Britain and France weren't consulted. They had nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. So who knows what would have happened there. So wrapping up here, Max Boot, and I encourage everyone listening to this to pick up your book, because we're not going to be able to cover every aspect of this man's life and career here. Looking back on Reagan, what were his most important achievements that have endured to this day?
Well, I think his two big achievements, and the reason why he's ranked as a top 10 president by many historians, I think that we've discussed them. The first one was he really gave America its mojo back after the 1970s. He guided America out of a very deep recession in the early 80s and really restored America's confidence in itself. He made the military feel good about itself. He made the country feel good about itself. And, he was able to run on It's Morning Again in America in 1984 and win 49 states doing that. And then his other big achievement, which we also just discussed in his second term, working with Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War, this confrontation that could have easily resulted in World War III. So I think those are two massive achievements for which he deserves a lot of credit, despite the many failures. And we haven't even discussed the Iran-Contra affair, his neglect of the AIDS pandemic. There were a lot of things he got wrong, but I think those are the two big things that he got right. One of his other legacies, which I'm not sure how enduring it is, but he certainly made Americans much more skeptical of government than they had been. And, even in the 1990s, Bill Clinton was declaring that the era of big government was over. Now, I'm not sure that the era of big government is still over, because there doesn't seem to be much interest in cutting spending or reducing budget deficits on the part of either Democrats or Republicans these days. So I think you can argue that we are living in the post-Reagan era, but certainly he left a large imprint on politics for the next, let's say, 30 years or so.
Well, the defense budget is approaching $1 trillion annually. I consider that big government as well. Some people may disagree and saying it needs to be that high. Well, we could talk about his failures here, because they don't seem to have stuck to Reagan's legacy. I mean, his record, not just Iran-Contra, but his record in Central America, fighting the Cold War there, in my view, is shameful. He had this proclivity of viewing tiny countries, Grenada being one of them, as integral to this global war to contain Soviet aggression, when in fact you had indigenous, if you will, Marxist revolutionary movements who were unhappy in those countries. I'm not saying those countries would have been better off had those Marxist revolutions succeeded, but he caused a lot of harm in parts of the world.
And there were a lot of scandals on his watch.
Savings and loan,
housing and urban development, of course, Iran-Contra, which was the worst scandal, many others. But yeah, I think people tend to remember more the legend of Ronald Reagan than the reality. And, as time went by, he looked better and better. And he got a tremendous amount of sympathy in 1994 when he announced very stoically that, he was suffering from Alzheimer's, and then people sympathized with him as he was dealing with this terrible ordeal. And then, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of that seemed to ratify the Reagan legacy. And in more recent years, I think Democrats and more centrist Republicans have often cited Reagan as a cudgel against Donald Trump and more hardline Republicans to say, Ronald Reagan wouldn't have agreed with what you're doing. He was very different. And so in hindsight, even though a lot of people at the time in the 1980s criticized Reagan for being too right-wing, in hindsight, a lot of people see him as actually a force for relative moderation. I think that's true because the Republican Party has swung quite far to the right since the days of Reagan.
I'm sure you can quote him verbatim when he finally goes on TV to admit that he was wrong in the Iran-Contra scandal. He said something like, the facts say that we were trading arms for hostages, but I still don't really believe it.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
There was a formulation that was worked out with his speechwriters, which he was very reluctant to do, but it was along the lines of, my heart says we didn't do it, but my head tells me that these are the facts. But that was kind of a way to massage the fact that he never really thought that he did anything wrong. But his political advisors and Nancy Reagan were telling him, you have to admit wrongdoing to move beyond this scandal.
Intentions were good, right? It just didn't work out. So something that I would like to see come back from that period. I don't like to idealize about past politics. There was no golden age. There was plenty of nasty partisanship and all. But the sunny optimism, a president who made us feel proud to be Americans and feel optimistic about our future. We're missing that today.
Absolutely. I think that was a lot of the reason why Reagan had so much bipartisan appeal. And he was somebody who saw himself as a uniter, not a divider, and always accentuated the positive and did not dwell on the negative. And that's pretty much the opposite of the current Republican approach.
The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat. And like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace.
On the next episode of History as It Happens. Are you getting ready for Thanksgiving? We're going to discuss the evolution of the Thanksgiving holiday. Why do we celebrate this in autumn? Why do we eat turkey? What does it have to do with the Pilgrims? That is next as we report history as it happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter every Friday. Sign up at historyasithappens.com.